All right, everyone. Glad to be here with you this morning. This beautiful Sunday morning, we are here to respond to questions or comments that may have come up as a result of the different information that's presented thus far. As you can tell, we've had a lot of guest speakers who have talked about issues facing Black students in education, ranging from preschool level of education to doctoral level of education. And what we're here to do is just really to respond to questions, comments that you might have. I'll be facilitating using the Q&A function, but both myself and Dr. Ford will be responding to questions today. So I see that some folks are still posting in the chat window. Please use the Q&A function because that's where we're going to be taking most of the questions from today. And we will go from there. I see that there are questions and comments posted in the chat, and so just know that we'll be getting to both. So I want to begin and just kind of work our way through. One question says, I am with a group speaking to a school board to advocate for ethnic studies to be added to the regular curriculum. What would your key points to say to convince them that this would be a good investment? Dr. Ford, do you want to take that one first?
Well, I'll take that because I was part of a group that was able to get African American history approved in Texas, and that's a very recent event. But I didn't. It was not my initiative. I was added onto it. So when I think about the importance of this, I think there are just very obvious things like increasing racial pride. We have culturally responsive education, increasing engagement. Students are more interested in learning when they see themselves in what is being taught. And by the way, I mean in a positive way. Also, it increases rigor because if done right, it promotes critical thinking and problem solving, as well as a sense of social justice, which we definitely need now. So I could say more, but those, what was it, 3 points, I definitely want to throw out there as part of your rationale. And then last, and I'm being sarcastic, but I'm being serious, what the crap we got out there now is not working. So let's try something different. We need curriculum that is culturally responsive and rigorous and anti-racist at all grade levels.
Absolutely. So the next question comes from Ann Paulson. It says, our faculty senate is leading a broad, multi-pronged effort to promote anti-racism in teaching, hiring, institutional systems. How do we include more people, the faculty that they, how do we include more people, the faculty that they are already great at this, or the faculty that think it's not important? If we don't reach faculty broadly, how can we expect to make an impact? So I'd like to take this one. My colleague, Frank, and I have a framework and a taxonomy that some of you may have seen before. It's a taxonomy and perspectives of educators. And what we do is we recognize that if you go to a campus to do a training, for example, on racial microaggressions, right? And then Frank and I get invited to do that a lot, either racial microaggressions or implicit bias. We walk into the room and it's very common for us to see that the person who's putting it on is dismayed, that they're down, that they wish that there was something different going on. And usually we're trying to figure out, okay, so what is that? And, I see a room full of 30 people, who are here to learn about this important topic. And then the response is often, well, when I put this session focused on microaggressions on, it was really because I wanted Jerry from chemistry to be here. Because everybody knows that Jerry is microaggressing his students, but is Jerry from chemistry going to come to a voluntary training session on microaggressions? No. And that's because we have educators who have different motivations and can be broken down into different categories. And maybe during the actual Black Minds, we'll go through this full framework, but essentially we break educators out based upon two characteristics. First, knowing what to do, the knowledge, and then second, have a willingness to do it, the action, right? And so when we break and when we look at that, those who have knowledge and have action, those who have knowledge but maybe aren't acting, and those who don't have knowledge and either aren't acting or whatever it might be, we break it down. We find that there's like 4 primary groups at first. First is the choir, the people who know what to do, have the willingness to do it, and have been engaging in it since the very beginning. And it's important for them to receive professional learning, professional development, professional opportunities. Why? Because it helps them to sharpen their tools and to become better at the work that they're doing. The second are those that we call the allies. The allies have a commitment to social justice, to educational equity, but they may not know what it's like to serve and work with, say, our Black students, right? And so the difference between the allies and our choir is knowledge, information, training, development, opportunities, because they're open to learning and growing. Now, those represent 2 key demographics, but I think we all know that if it was just choir and allies, our schools would be performing great. Our colleges would be producing students at the rate that they need to be. Our universities would be graduating students, having them go on to graduate school careers, but that's not what's happening. And that's because we have other groups, right? So one of the other groups we have are what we call the resistors. These are people who don't know what to do, so they don't have the knowledge. And second, their unwillingness to do it, so they don't have the action. So there's no knowledge, no action. And we see that there's 2 different types of resistors. First, there are active resistors. Active resistors actively resist. They hear that myself, Frank, Donna are coming to their campus to talk about educational equity, social justice, microaggressions, implicit bias, racial battle fatigue, whiteness, white fragility, whatever it might be. And their response is to be vocal, to push back, to send an email out to everyone saying, don't go. This is an example of reverse racism or reverse discrimination. Or they're the ones to purposely make it so it's difficult for the work to move forward. But the truth is, we think that those active resistors oftentimes represent a much larger demographic of people than they actually do. In reality, they're usually a small subset, but just like bullies, sometimes people think that more people think that the bully is right. Why? Because they're afraid to say anything. And most people are the bystanders. They're what we call the passive resistors. These are the people who just want to stay out of the fray. They hear that we're coming, they're like, okay, well, that's taking place, but I'm not going to go. And they're going to vote on this with their lack of presence. Mm-hmm. And then the other group that we see are those who are defiant. These are the people who know what to do, but willingly choose not to do it. Now, sometimes there's people who are choir who've just been burnt out and become recalcitrant and been part of the problem. But you can also have people who have been active resistors who've been exposed to mandatory training and now they're part of the defiant. Now, if you ever heard me talk about this taxonomy before, you know that there's actually one more group that we recognize that's taking place, and it's the group that falls in the middle. The people who think they know what to do and really don't. And we call them the oblivious. And there's different types of individuals who are part of the oblivious. First, there are people who are saviors. They think that their job is to save, not to empower. What these people do is essentially they bring deficit mindsets to equity work, right? Because they think that this community can't do it without me, that I'm here to save them, right? That's the wrong mindset because it makes it about you. The second group of people who are oblivious are those who are non-reflective. These are the people who know the right language, right? They'll say Latinx as opposed to Latino because they know it's more gender inclusive, right? They'll introduce themselves using pronouns when they're engaging all student communities, right? They'll use the word equity as opposed to equality, right? But if you look at what they say, the words that come from their mouth and then the fruit of their labor is the works of their hands, what you'll find is those two are very disconnected from one another. And so people can say the right things without having the right commitments and the right actions to go along with it. And then lastly, there are those who are grandstanders. Now, when if you were to go back 20, 30 years ago, was being an equity advocate cool? No, it wasn't. It's very different now than it was then. You can actually make a reputation for yourself and a career for yourself focused on equity, but that also opens the door now for people who think it's about them, their own public image, their own ability to advance their career, them, rather than the students that they serve. And you can always spot these individuals based upon one key thing. Do they do things that are meaningful, intentional, and impactful? Or do they do things that sound good, that look good, but ultimately don't produce results. So that to with that framework in mind, I think part of the reason that there's challenge there is that we have different people with different motivations. So one size fits all approach for professional learning, for interventions won't work, because we have to be differentiated with our faculty, with our staff, with our educators, just like we have to be with our students. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Dr. Ford to see if you want to add anything to that.
Well, yes, I love the taxonomy, the framework, and explained very well. So what I want to say is leadership has to set the standards and be unapologetic and assertive and about what needs to happen. And if there's no buy-in, then leadership needs to tell what the consequences are. And this is it's always been urgent, but especially with this racial pandemic. So I want to repeat, always been urgent, but even more urgent with this racial pandemic. So leadership is important to do what Luke just laid out. So it reminds me of classes where students can have to take a class, is required versus, it's an elective. And the mindset, the attitudes, the behaviors, the comments and everything are just so drastically different from those two groups. And then they would certainly fit into your model. Required versus optional. Right now, it needs to be required.
Agreed. It has to be.
Has to be.
People don't do optional. Okay, here's another question. This comes from Diana. Donna, I'll pitch this one to you. How can we, school leaders and educators, develop a transformative justice school culture where each of us holds ourselves accountable to practice anti-racist and student-centered teaching?
Well, I think that really goes back to kind of what you were saying earlier just now in terms of your model and what my response was to it. And that is and then add it to what you just laid out, do an audit of classes, an audit of programs to make sure that equity, diversity, and inclusion are embedded in them, and not lost when I say embedded, but central to what is being taught, not an afterthought, but a forethought. And when we do this audit, unfortunately, we'll see that most of it is colorblind and culture blind, which contributes to students being so miseducated. So this audit of courses and holding teachers, faculty, and teachers too, Peter 12, accountable for what's in the curriculum is essential. And we need to stop having just one diversity class. It needs to be in every class. And I don't care whether we're talking about engineering, medicine, it doesn't matter, curriculum instruction, special education, gifted education. It needs to be in all coursework. We are preparing teachers. We are preparing educators. We are preparing future professionals and current professionals to be equity minded. And we really need to explain what equity means.
Absolutely. Next question comes from Dominic Hitchcock. It says, I've had several conversations with colleagues regarding authentic care for Black students, and then says that there are common comments. It's not fair to other students. How do you do that anyways? All students deserve care. How do I respond to these comments? I think I can take that first. I think you respond by saying that if all students are receiving care, then how can we see differential outcomes, right? So I think it really goes to I think this is really the base of this question is really the equity versus equality debate. Do we give people what they need to reach where they need to go, or do we treat everyone the same? I think about this in the context of being a parent, right? I have 3 kids. Every single one of my kids needs different things. One's outgoing, one's shy. One really likes math, one likes to write. One likes to play with this, one likes to play with that. And so I don't necessarily come in and say that I'm going to give them all the same thing, because they don't all want the same thing. They need different things in order for them to be able to be successful. And so I think that at the root of that is that question. But I also think it goes to a misunderstanding of care. Now, too many teachers say, I care about my students, but then if you look at what they do, there's a demonstrated inaction towards certain students who are different from them. So ultimately, it's about understanding, what does care mean? I can say I care about something, but it doesn't mean that I'm doing it. I care about the gym, but doesn't mean I do it every day. I care about eating well, doesn't mean I do it every day, right? So there are things that we can say that we espouse as things that we care about, but it doesn't mean that we're actually doing it. So let's define what authentic care actually looks like. Authentic care is a shared or linked vested interest, so that if the student does well, that they know that you are going to personally feel like you did well. If they hit the mark, if they succeed on the assignment, if they reach the heights that they were looking to reach, that you are going to personally feel like you did well because you have a shared or linked vested interest with them. And on the flip side, if they don't do well, if they stumble, if they fall, if they miss the mark, that you are going to personally feel like you did not do well, because that's what authentic care actually looks like. So I would ask them to describe what they mean by care. And if it is an intellectual care and not a demonstrated action of care, then I would argue that it's not care at all. It's just window dressing.
And earlier, the term reverse discrimination was used. Not that you were supporting it, Luke, but I'm saying it was in part of what you were saying, that people will evoke that, that assertion. There is no damn such thing as reverse discrimination, and I'm tired of hearing about it. So that question about, we are doing something more and different for our Black students is tantamount to reverse discrimination, because we're not doing the same thing for our white students, is problematic. Equity is doing something different because, as Luke just said, students need something different. And this is you could take race off of this, and if they had special education needs, it will be the same thing. What does that student need to fulfill their potential, whatever that is? What does a student need to be successful? And yes, if you care about your students, you will do everything you can to make sure that they are successful in spite of any pushback. You will do what you can because you care about your students. So we talk about reading, writing, and arithmetic. Well, the other R, so to speak, is relationships. Yes. And that is, caring is fundamental to building relationships. And when those relationships are positive, students do better. And by the way, students know when you care about them and when you don't. They know. So you cannot even fake it. They know when you're being disingenuous. So yeah, caring is important, and students will know when you do. And you got to invest and have strong relationships with the students.
So here's a question, and I'm going to skip around because I know people are coming in at different points, but we're going to try to get to as many of these questions as we can. But here's one that I think both of us can respond to, Donna. It says, I am in leadership at a PWI, which is a predominantly white institution, and constantly experience both micro and macroaggressions, which have manifested into racial battle fatigue. As such, I've been asked by my dean to come up with a plan for how I am going to manage the racism I encountered. For bringing these experiences to the forefront, my integrity, expertise, and professionalism has been questioned. Do you all have any suggestions on recommendations for how I can coexist in this space? I'll let you go first, Dr. Ford, and then I'll take that as well.
Well, unfortunately, racial battle fatigue is real, and you need to document, what's going on and who is contributing to that. Unfortunately, you might have to educate your, higher ups on what racial battle fatigue or the Black tax looks like, and then the consequences. You also need to talk about racial trauma because that has an impact on the quality of our productivity and work. So if that were me, I would be looking at it as usual, an opportunity where we have to educate others about what we are experiencing, and that is not a figment of your imagination.
And I'll also add to that that it's also unfair that you have to be the one to educate in an environment where you're the one who's being affected by it. It's totally unacceptable. So part of how I think about it is like the level of degrees, right? Do you feel that it's an environment that you can exist and thrive in? Right? Because every single environment that we're in is a racist environment, right? So let's not fool ourselves. So the question is an environment that you feel like you can personally push through, resist, and thrive. And I think you have to ask yourself, if you get to the point where it's having a personal effect on your health, a personal effect on your productivity, your passion, your ability to do the work that you're doing, then I would give you the same guidance that parents, when they ask us about their child and being in a school environment where there's trauma, I would say, according to my colleague Andre Branch, never leave your child in an unhealthy environment for the sake of a good school. You got to ultimately make sure that if it reaches that point where it's going up above your ability to be able to address, especially if it's an environment where there is no openness to change, then you have to ask yourself, is that environment that you want to continue to be in? So those are questions that you really have to engage, but it's something that we want you to keep in mind. Next question, and I'm gonna, this one specifically for Dr. Ford. I said, last time there was basically a discussion of indicators of ascribing intelligence for Black children, focused on this assumption that Black children are academically inferior. Dr. Ford, can you speak to how these behaviors impact gifted girls of color?
Well, so the ascription of intelligence, and for far too many Black children and some other minoritized children, we are considered less than capable, less intelligent. Our work ethic is questioned. When we do well, that's questioned, as I talk about all the time. So when just Black students, period, but I know you said Black girls, are in these hostile environments, like was said in the previous question, then it contributes to a lack of retention. In other words, we get, as a Black girl or boy, we get recruited to gifted programs or gifted classes, and that's great. But then once we're in there and it's hostile, like that previous question, then there's an issue with retention, and this contributes to those low numbers. So for us to persist in gifted programs is often a Pyrrhic victory. And, it is a sacrifice socially, it's a sacrifice emotionally, it's a sacrifice psychologically, but it looks good on the transcript that you were in gifted programs. But again, with that previous question, when it's hostile and it's not going to change, it's time to go. It is time to go, and hopefully it'll be to a better place. So we have to hire more Black teachers, period. But in the context of this question, in gifted education, and there's so much I can say about this, but anyway, in gifted education, hire more teachers, period. But we also need to do the training that's already been mentioned, and do that in gifted education, and it needs to be mandatory. And those teachers who are not referring Black students to gifted programs, or who are creating a hostile environment once we are in the gifted programs, there needs to be some consequences. And that means, like, get out, go somewhere else, do no harm.
Absolutely. So next question says, I'm interested to know your perspective on Kendi's opinion about the use of the term microaggression. He argues that it is a post-racial way of avoiding the use of racism. My intent with this question is sincere and not meant to be a judgment. No, I mean, I absolutely think that it is racism. Microaggression is just a way of describing a certain subset of racism, just like there is explicit racism and other forms of macroaggressions. So I think that, so I do agree that in a post-racial society, it is an easier term for some audiences to engage, that it may be a way of saying things and calling out racism in a way that may seem less direct. But my experience, personally, I'm one who does a lot of training on microaggressions, is that it is a helpful framework for people who want to be able to do different and be better. But I actually think, from my own personal perspective, I think that understanding microaggressions is actually better for the people who are affected by it. There's something about the power of being able to go into a classroom as a professor, start to speak, and then have one of your students say, "Oh, wow, you're so articulate. I didn't expect you to be this good." There's something about walking through the bookstore on campus and being followed around and knowing that it's an assumption of criminality, right? There's something about being in a faculty meeting and have someone say, "Yeah, those students, they don't care. They're not really here for school. They're only here for the financial aid." There's something powerful about being able to say, "That's an ascription of intelligence. That's an assumption of criminality. That's pathologizing culture." Or the other one that my wife and I talk about a lot is presumption of defilement. Presumption of defilement is when this embedded notion that certain people, particularly Black people, are diseased, dirty, or somehow gross in that type of way, right? So let me give you some examples. We have this thing, we love the cruise, right? That's how my wife and I, when we can, when there's no coronavirus, when the COVID isn't out, we love the cruise. But the challenge is, when we go on a cruise, we have this thing called K-2, right? And K represents us, and -2 represents the number of people when we get into a pool or a hot tub, that when they see us get in, that get out. Why? Because this notion, they don't want to share that same water, the same space. Dr. Ford's shaking her head because she knows what I'm talking about. Or when you're going around and you're shaking people's hands, and then you notice that after they shake your hand, that they go to the bathroom to wash their hand, but they didn't think to do that when it was somebody else. Now, in the time of COVID, yeah, if you shake somebody's hand, I'm sure everybody's washing the hand. But before COVID, most people weren't doing that as a regular practice. So what was it about me that reminded you that you should wash your hands, right? We see it when people get on buses, right? And, oh, I'm going to move to a different place because I don't want to sit next to this person because there's something about them that might be defiled, right? We see it in schools when children are repeatedly sent to the school nurse with the assumption that they have lice in their hair when they don't, right? It's just this embedded assumption that Black people are in some ways defiled, right? So why does it matter? I think microaggressions is helpful because it tells us what are these things that are taking place. It gives us a language and a framework to describe the racism that we encounter on a daily basis.
Absolutely. And when you look at how microaggressions are explained in Daryl Sue's and his colleagues' book, then he lays out, he talks about old-fashioned racism and things like that. So microaggressions, I think is very clear that racism is the focus. And as you said, Luke, it lays it out really well so you can name what just happened. You can name it, as opposed to shaking your head like, what was that about? We know exactly why you moved, why when before COVID, when I handed you money, you laid my change down on the counter, but you gave other people the money in their hand, etc. Why we're followed around the store. Why are you people so loud? Why are you so this? So it names it. And it's just one of many theories that can be used. You can also use Merton's work to name the racism that's been seen, and it goes good with your typology. Luke. And then you can look at Gordon Alport's degrees of prejudice, and it names 5 of them. So that so there's those 3 in particular I use in my classes, and with really real world examples, and my students get it.
Absolutely. So there's been several questions about the taxonomy that I mentioned, the choir, allies, resistors, defiant. I'll post a link to it in case anybody wants to read. Frank and I have a piece that's been written on it. It doesn't include all the components, but includes most of it. But in the interim, I'm going to turn to a question that was specifically directed to Dr. Ford. It says, as an education specialist, I'm concerned with both the disproportionate overrepresentation of students of color in special education, but also how to make sure students of color that do have disabilities are correctly identified and given the supports they need. We're supposed to use exclusionary criteria to avoid misidentifying students. Do you think the overrepresentation is due to not carefully evaluating students? Also, have you seen ways that trauma, both systemic and individual, has a negative impact on students' learning and present day, perhaps as a type of learning disability?
Well, that's that question. First of all, I appreciate it, but that topic of especially special education overrepresentation, we're going to be talking about that. And is it going to be our next session, Luke?
Yes, our next session for sure.
Okay, so we're going to be talking about that. So, please sign in. So, and I understand the piece about exclusionary procedures, but if you have racist instruments, if you have racist attitudes, no matter what you do, there's going to be over representation. And it is in, not to say, well, we're going to talk about it at our next session, but it is in the high incidence areas that are just so very undeniably subjective. When subjectivity is at work, then we're talking about racism and overrepresentation. Then you don't see overrepresentation to the same degree in low incidence area. So when it comes to vision, if there's no question what your vision is. Is it 20/20 or is it et cetera? When it comes to hearing, when it comes to walking, et cetera, it's the high incidence areas where we see racism, and let's call it that, operating. So unfortunately though, it's hard to tell who really needs, when it comes to Black students in particular, especially our Black boys, who really need special education services and which one don't. But in order to really dissect that, you need to have an extensive evaluation of that child, and be mindful of what measures are being used in order to do that, what criteria are being used. So it is very, yeah, it's problematic, very troubling for those who really need help. But anyway, it's really troubling for those who really need help because of our policies, procedures, attitudes, and measures are just so problematic. And let me just give one quick incident. This is years ago. My son is 40, but when he was in the 8th grade, I was teaching at University of Virginia, and we had just moved there. The teachers were adamant that he had some emotional problems and behavioral problems. I refuse to give in and allow them to do an assessment for that. And listen, I'm in my department that I'm in is special education. You know that one of the special education administrators had the caudacity, and I meant caudacity, to come to my damn office to recruit my son for effing, I ain't say it, but for special education for emotional problems. So I said, you know what? Let me show them something. I went and filled out the paperwork, answered it honestly. And it did say he had emotional problems. I looked at the items on that damn checklist and they were ridiculous. Has he ever argued with you? What teenager doesn't? Has he ever tried to skip curfew? What teenager doesn't? So these questions were just ridiculous, ridiculous. And I thought that they were, you would be destined if you answered honestly, I'm sorry, your child will be destined to get a label. And my son had no emotional and behavioral disorder. None. Not then, not now. So if they're going to do that with me, a professor, what will they do with others who have fewer credentials and just don't know how to give pushback to this system of racism that, going back to Black Minds Matter, that promotes the special ed to prison pipeline?
Absolutely. So next question comes from Michelle Harper. It says, looking for any specific practices that every faculty member should utilize in order to equitize online learning. I'm interested in tangible ideas to start using in 3 weeks. I realize that it's easy to be colorblinded in the online setting, besides Zoom, etc. What are additional ways to make the needs of students more visible in the online setting? So it actually just so happens that one of our guests this week on Black Minds Matter will be Frank Harris III. And we did a webinar a little bit earlier this summer focused on equity-minded online teaching. And so I'll send that as a link to you. And it talks about all the different factors that we need to keep in mind. And then it offers some practices. One of the practices that we talk about is being intrusive. So it's recognizing that we have to proactively reach out to students, find out what's going on, and then be very responsive to their needs. It is really for us to think differently about how we teach our classes overall. One of the things that becomes particularly important in the online environment is cultural relevance. If you think about the in-person, right, all the opportunities to hear from one another, to engage one another, to have there be kind of a diverse setting. In an online setting, particularly in an asynchronous course, it can be incredibly stale, right? No pictures, no images, nothing that helps to make those connections. And so one of the things that we believe is important is to recognize that your LMS, your learning management system, is probably what they see as their experience at the institution. So what are the ways that you can redesign it to ensure that it is conveying a sense of welcomeness and embracing all students? I'm going to send you the link right now for that actual webinar. In fact, I'll put it in the chat window just in case anybody else wants to see it, and then kind of punt this back to Dr. Ford, because there's a question that I'm hoping that she might be able to respond to. It says, what can be done to save historically Black colleges and universities since they have a powerful positive impact on African-American success?
Now, that one is a tough one for me because unfortunately, and I do mean unfortunately, I've never attended an HBCU, but I'm very passionate about the importance of their existence. I mean, they truly, truly, truly matter. So I think that it's just important for us to keep investing in HBCUs and talking about the importance of those particular universities and why they really do matter to students. My concern with some HBCUs is that, what's the saying? In the daytime, they're Black. In the nighttime, they're white. So some HBCUs are not even majority Black anymore. And I'd like to look at, I mean, that should be looked at in terms of, the impact that it has on us. Does that mean that we no longer have a seat at the table at universities that were created because we're not allowed to go to PWIs? So yeah, just invest fiscally, financially, and publicly is just what comes to mind.
Yeah, and I would just argue that I think that our way forward, our path forward, is a combination. It's a combination of fostering and creating successful, predominantly Black institutions. When we have HBCUs, we have PBIs, we have opportunities for that. We have Afrocentric schools, and I think that the other option at the same time is to try why we do that and help to build up those institutions, and in some cases to rebuild them, to be focused on what can we do within our PWIs and our TWIs, our historically white institutions and our predominantly white institutions, to ensure that they're supporting all of our students. And one of the things that I believe that we have to do is to create a green book. Um, Many of you may have seen the movie The Green Book, and I'm not talking about the movie, I'm talking about the book itself. It was a book that had a green cover that told people, if you are driving through these areas, these neighborhoods, these cities, these locales, here is the restaurant you can go to and be safe. Here is the hotel that you can stay at for accommodations. Here is a park that you can go to that is welcoming, right? These are locations that you can go to that you will be supported in, right? And ultimately, what we need to do is to create a green book or an underground railroad within our own institutions, identifying the resources that people need, and then identifying people in each of those areas who can help our students. So, for example, let's say that you have a student who is, and let's say this is a faculty member talking with a student, and the student has a clear financial aid challenge, right? It would be saying to that student, instead of saying, hey, go to financial aid, which we know that there are going to be some students who are simply not going to do so, and financial aid may be a place where they experience microaggressions. In fact, we usually call financial aid in the library microaggression central. But ultimately, if you say go to financial aid, they may not go. And if they go, they may have a bad experience. They may go there and be microaggressed at the front counter. So it's better to know, hey, I know that I need to send them to Sarah in financial aid because Sarah will care about them. She'll support them. She'll take the time. She'll be patient, right? So ultimately, it's about identifying people in different areas who can serve to create an underground railroad, while at the same time, we're working to create a better overall situation for our institutions within those predominantly white and historically white institutions, recognizing that we also have our Black institutions that have to be further reinforced and built out. So how I like to think about it is like this. During the time of slavery and the abolitionist movement, it wasn't when people were going on the Underground Railroad, right? They weren't just going to anybody to escape slavery. They were going to people who they knew that they could trust based upon those who were part of that network. We need to be similarly committed to creating the same types of networks within our own institutions, so that when they go to these different places, that they know that they're going to be safe. A lot of educators talk about this. They talk about the concept of a warm handoff, right? Which means that, hey, you're with one educator and they do a warm handoff to another educator. Well, remember this, you can't do a warm handoff to a cold person. So it has to be to somebody who is committed, who cares about the students, who's invested in them and their success. So ultimately, that's part of the solution. So yes, HBCUs are absolutely important. PBIs, absolutely important. We want to build out and reinforce those institutions, while at the same time recognizing that within our predominantly white or historically white institutions, or our predominantly non-Black institutions, that we're also creating pathways for all of our students. Okay, next question says, can you talk about the importance of having leadership that is equity-minded, that prioritizes creating equitable outcomes for students of color who've been disproportionately marginalized? This would seem to be critical at community colleges. You know, I'll just say personally that I have never seen a community college increase student outcomes where there wasn't an all-in commitment from the leadership. And when I say leadership, I don't just mean the president. So the president has to first be the one to be out front. This is important. We're committed to this. This is urgent. It's an institutional priority, and continue that messaging. That's critical. But if I've gone to an institution where the only person that cares about equity is the president, and I have, then guess what? All you have is the foundation of your institution, which is your faculty, your staff, who are essentially creating a hostile experience for students. So ultimately, it's about having the president, but it's also about having the president of the Senate, the faculty Senate, the staff Senate, university Senate, college Senate, call different places, different things in different places, but the Senate, having at least one board member, and then also very key, having either some places call it provost, some places call it vice president of instruction, some places call it vice president of academic affairs, but whoever is responsible for the academic enterprise within that institution has to also be vocal in their commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion. If you take away any of those pieces, the president, the Senate, a board member, and the VPI, if you take away any of those four pieces, that's an institution that's not going to be successful. So if you want to ensure that an institution can be, that's the first place to start. So, and it's not just having those people, but they have to be vocal, right? There's a lot of people who I have a heart for equity, I have a mind for equity, but if I don't have a voice and actions for equity, then I have inaction. So Dr. Ford, here's a question that I think you might want to talk to a little bit. And it talks about, can you go more into the effects of Black Lives Matter being trendy now, and how people have the right verbiage, but can maybe bear bad fruit? Have you seen this as a pattern?
No, I don't. Well, it definitely exists, but I have not seen it as a pattern. And I'm glad that is, is so. It may, so in some people's minds it's trendy, but when you put action behind it, as was just said, when you put voice behind it, when you put funding behind it, resources, then it's no longer trendy. So, but it's the same with equity. Every time I turn around hearing, this is an equitable school district, this is an equitable university, this is an equitable program. I think equity is more trendy than Black Lives Matter, quite frankly. So go ahead, Duke.
No, I was just going to agree with that point. Yeah.
Yeah, I think equity is more trendy. And I don't think many people understand or know what that means, although it was just explained here in quite well. But now, and if I were to detect that it was just trendy, then I would speak up about it. I would have a problem. I would say something to the district, to the college, to the university, to the organization, and hold them accountable to back it up. Back up that Black Lives Matter. Back up that Black minds matter. Prove it instead of just posting it and blasting it everywhere.
Just so you know, we have people who are typing in the chat window saying that they are clapping.
Oh.
Okay, so Dr. Ford, this one's clearly for you. It says, with reservations but humility, I had my child tested for 504 because he consistently failed all tests in classes in middle school. Prior to the completion of the evaluation, I received a phone call suggesting my son was, quote unquote, the R word, which is not the language used today when assessing children for learning deficits. When we met in a meeting for the results, he was found not to qualify for services. Do you all have recommendations for how you managed or ascertain additional support for your child when they are prematurely labeled in these types of institutional settings and may also be exhibiting signs of disinterest in school?
That is so predictable. So the teacher or teachers are the problem, not your child. And then you have to look at what those assessments are. Were the teacher made quizzes and exams? Was it formal testing? Even if it was formal testing, like an intelligence test or an achievement test, you got to look at the environment under which the child was assessed. And that, again, could be hostile. and it could be an uncaring, racist, anti-Black teacher. You also have to consider test anxiety. Does your child have, does he get anxious? And we could talk about, what is it, stereotype threat, for example. Steele's work, Aaron's work on stereotype threat when it comes to testing. So consider that also. But when you have such a disconnect between what's happening in the classroom and then when there was a more formal evaluation, you got to go back and look at what is going on in the classroom. And as Luke said earlier with this green book, find out who the teacher is for a Black child, because that's the one that he currently has or had may not be the one. You got to ask around and find out the best teacher. I mean, you may not be able to move to a new school, but who is a better teacher? Among some of them might be all bad apples, but at least one of them, maybe still the better one for your child. So if you said he was not found eligible for having services, then the teacher needs to be contacted. And you need to be unafraid and unintimidated, because that is your child and you're the number one person to be the advocate. So you have to ask some questions that you may not have before to understand why he wasn't doing well in, and I'm going to say her, because most teachers are female, but in her class. You cannot let this go, sweep this under the rug and not address it. So I want to go to the teacher and hold her accountable. That's your child, and you're not gonna let him be misdiagnosed.
Absolutely. Next question comes from Mary. It says, I work at a women's center at a suburban community college, and the push to start the race and diversity conversations is in the works. The staff and faculty racial can be counted on two hands, so not a lot of diversity. I was asked what to do, and and what to convey to students. I started a group for women of color, but the other persuasion needs to be in attendance. Can you extend some insight for me? That is the demographic of people of color, just clarifying. So, I mean, there's a lot of institutions that have either women of color initiatives or men of color initiatives. And there's been a lot of questions about, hey, I run a Black male initiative and the Black males aren't coming, or I'm running a women of color initiative and I need to see more around that. So let me just say this. People and students go to where they feel that they are cared and valued, and where they feel that their identities are embraced. And so one of the things that I think you should do is, if you want to ensure that if it's a Black male program, that Black males go, or it's a women of color program, that women of color go, or if it's a transgender non-binary program, that transgender and non-binary students go, ultimately what it comes down to is this. You have to start with listening. Do some focus groups, find out what are the challenges that they're experiencing. What is it that they're missing from the institution? What are the barriers that they're facing? What are the things that can help and support them in their success? That has to be the front-loaded part of it, having those conversations. And then those conversations inform the actual interventions and support that you have. And so ultimately, it's not just about bringing people together, but it's about bringing people together to address the very real and specific problems that they're facing, and to build a community where they feel like there is a network of support. In a face-to-face environment, I would also add 9 times out of 10, if you want to have students there, make sure you bring food, right? And so I'm going to say that as, yes, that applies here just kind of as a general thing for all students. But we know that when it comes to our students of color, that they are much more likely to experience issues of food insecurity, housing insecurity, transportation concerns, and employment barriers. We call that the big 4: food insecurity, housing insecurity, transportation concerns, employment barriers. Though I would argue that maybe in the time of COVID, there's 5, which is access to technology. So insecurities, a student doesn't ever have just one insecurity, right? Oftentimes, we'll go to a campus and we'll see that there is a a food pantry. And I'm like, I'm glad to see they have a food pantry, but where's the bus passes? Where's the secondhand clothing closet? Where is the opportunities for them to have different jobs on campus? So ultimately, students don't experience these challenges in isolation. So it's about recognizing the complexity of those challenges and then solving for one variable, more than one variable at a time. If I was going to do a regression model that was supposed to solve for insecurity, I wouldn't just have one variable. I'm not just going to look at food insecurity. I'm going to have a model that addresses all forms of insecurity. Because why? Because they're interrelated. And not, if a student doesn't have money, they might not have a stable place to live. They might not have stable food, right? So those are two very separate points, but I felt like they were important. So one, if you're trying to get people to come to your initiative, make sure that you're collecting data that's reflective of them and you're providing them with the supports. Secondly, all events, when you can have them back in person, should have food to the extent that they can, because we know that this is an adverse impact in our communities of color. Next question says, I have the opportunity to completely overhaul my elementary methods class. I am at a Ailey Smile. I'm not sure what that is. If you were preparing elementary teachers, what would you put into the methods class to prepare them to be transformative in the early grades?
Well, I will make sure, and this is not ranked, but I would make sure that we have multicultural curriculum, authentic multicultural curriculum. And I use James Banks's 4 levels of how to infuse multicultural content into the curriculum. So there's contributions, additive, transformation, and social action, but some change it to social justice. So the multicultural curriculum must be there. And that is the main model that's out there to really show you how to do it. You also need to make sure that you're focusing on, critical and creative thinking. So many of us, or many of you may be familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, his 6 levels of how to infuse multicultural content into the curriculum. I would want to make sure that the top 3 levels of Bloom's taxonomy, that those are targeted, so that there is going to be rigor rather than the lower 3, which I call rigor mortis. Students bored as hell, and you want to know why they're falling asleep and things like that, disengaged. So make sure that it's critical thinking and problem solving. Also, and that's just like one model, but there are others out there. Multicultural curriculum and critical thinking, creative thinking would be my priorities. There's others, multicultural literature. Multicultural literature is essential. And I would go to Lee and Lowe's book, Lee and Lowe's books, and it's online to decide the best multicultural literature that I'm going to use. And then there's also some books put out, recommended, in Wisconsin and other places. So those are the minima that I would recommend in terms of overhauling the curriculum or changing and tinkering with what you already have. Culture blind curriculum is ineffective. And so I don't know, anyway, culture blind curriculum is ineffective. And I want to say this, multicultural education is for everybody. And these damn white students of all ages need it sometimes more than we do to deal with what they have mislearned about minoritized people. So they come to school early on with these stereotypes about us, and then there's disharmony in schools. A multicultural curriculum using Banks' model will help address that, and students will get along better in terms of harmony. But teacher training is essential to make that happen.
Dr. Ford, there's a question for you. It says, can you post the link to the online bookstore Dr. Ford referred to?
Is that going to be in question and answer in chat?
It's in the question and answer. So if you have the link, if you could send it, if not, we can send it out in the email.
Yeah. Oh, I see where it says type answer. Okay.
All right. So while you're taking a look at that, and folks, we're very close to the end of our time, so we're only going to take one or two more questions. But hopefully this has been value added, and we certainly think that these kinds of conversations are absolutely essential. So question says, this is from Sandy. It says, Dr. Tolson and Dr. Wood pointed out that our teacher education programs do not require a focus on whether a teacher can demonstrate that they care about students. Question, what would or could it look like to do this in teacher education programs, and how would you evaluate it? I think that how I would personally evaluate it is based upon several factors. I would first look at, to what degree are they not doing some of the challenging things that we see? Hyper surveilling Black children, singling them out for punishment, labeling them as bad, troublemakers, defiant, physical, aggressive, subjecting them to larger and more prolonged punishments, assuming that they're academically inferior, those types of things. I would first look at, are they able to engage in ways that are at the very, very least doing no harm? Then I would look at some of the other things that they can be doing in terms of, where do they spend their time? Do they demonstrate a vested interest in all children, but particularly in this context, Black children, by spending time with them, by conveying positive messages to them that validate them and validate their abilities and validate their identities and their experiences? Do they talk with them about matters that relate to school and to non-school, so that they're getting to know them? There are a whole host of different things that I think that we could evaluate on, both in terms of what we don't want to see them doing, but then even more importantly, what we do want to see them doing. And it really comes down to, I think, three general areas or general buckets. The first area is perceptions. How do they perceive students, and how do they perceive their own role as educators? Do they perceive them through a lens of microaggressions and bias? And to what extent are they actively working to address that? The second is relationships. Relationships are a foundational precondition to effective teaching, learning, counseling, advising, or any support practices. In fact, you heard Dr. Ford say it's one of the R's, right? Relationships are absolutely critical. And what we find is, it doesn't matter how good you teach. It doesn't matter how well your syllabus is put together, how carefully tailored your notes are, how nice your PowerPoint or Prezi looks. None of those things about teaching matter unless you have a relationship with students, because that relationship is going to serve as the foundation for you to ensure that what you are trying to deliver in terms of content is actually being received. So otherwise, you're probably doing more damage than good. So ultimately, those are some things that I would think about with this. Dr. Ford, anything you'd add?
Well, I think about that statement, children don't care what you know until they know that you what? Care. That is just fundamental, and there's just no getting around it. Unfortunately, there's not enough caring for our Black students, especially our Black males, by this predominantly white female teaching force. Some colleagues and I wrote in 2018 a Bill of Rights. So it's called Culturally Responsive, Equity-Based Bill of Rights for gifted students of color. And I would encourage you to, even though you're not working with gifted students, and even though it's was for P to 12, take a look at those 8 sections, which I don't have memorized, so I'm sorry. But take a look at those 8 sections and use that to evaluate your practices. So, I mean, like, there's testing and assessment, there's advocacy, there's teacher demographics or something like that. Anyway, look at the 8 sections, and that will give you more insight into what needs to happen to make education really more transformative and responsive, where your students are believe you hold them in high regard. But I can't stop thinking about this notion of care. And on my personal website, I wrote an article about schools where there's care and where there is not. I forgot what I called it, but it's on my website. And I think it's just common sense that when you care about your students, they care about you, and you will get so much more out of them when they know this. Um, you want to be remembered, and I'm talking to faculty too. You want to be remembered as the professor, the teacher that the students really, really loved, not the one that they hated and regretted having in their educational experience. So we have to work on that, and um, it should come naturally, as it does with children. Period. Like your own children, you shouldn't have to work too hard at it. This is a profession you chose. You should care for your students, regardless of the color of their skin and their income.
Absolutely. So at this point, we are really at time, and we just want to thank everyone for coming. Now, we just want to give a really quick preview to what you're going to see this week. We have several guests for Black Minds Matter this week. It includes Dr. William Smith, who is the founder of the concept of racial battle fatigue, who's going to be talking about that. We're going to have Dr. Frank Harris talking about issues of microaggressions, and how the linkage between racial battle fatigue and microaggressions. And then we're going to have Dr. Ebony Zamani Gallagher talking about issues of educational equity. In addition, our featured guest this week is Michael Brown Sr., who is the father of Michael Brown. Many of you, of course, are very aware of that case. And we're looking forward to being able to hear from his father about who Michael was. As you probably noticed, when we bring in these families, one of the things we want to do is to present an alternative narrative, a counter narrative to the narrative that's been presented in the media that tries to denigrate and put down these families. And I think that hopefully what people are seeing as part of this, who are participating, is that there was a loss. This was a human being whose life was taken, who was murdered. These are individuals who were on the pathways to creating better lives for themselves and for their families, but were viewed as being lesser than simply because of the color of their skin. And as a result, they lost their lives. We think that there's, again, a direct linkage between Black lives and Black minds. As we say, you cannot value the life. If you don't value the life, then you certainly will not value the mind. And so we look forward to seeing you this week. And we also hope that you'll spread the word and encourage other people to come. And we're going to do more of these live sessions throughout the class. And again, we'll give more than one day's notice moving forward. But we definitely want to do so. We're receiving a lot of requests. There's a lot of questions that we weren't able to get to. And I do recognize there's several questions about homeschool that have come up that we'll make sure that we address next time. But we just want to thank you for your commitment to our Black students. And just remember that Black minds matter.
And I appreciate that we have the families of those who were murdered humanizing their children. And I love how one of the questions you created, Luke, for this was asking them about their educational experiences. What was school like? And that's really important. What was school like? And then, we go into other areas. So this is exciting, despite having 2 pandemics. Well, we actually have 3, going back to what you said, Luke. We have, poverty. Poverty is a pandemic. All right, so we have these 3 pandemics, and what can we do with what we have to make sure that we are part of the solution and not the damn problem?
Absolutely. So as everyone goes out for the rest of your day, just know that we appreciate your ability to be able to be here. For those who are able to watch this not in real time, thank you for doing so. And just remember that Black minds matter.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. All right. Bye-bye.